Hey everyone, and welcome to another Mammoth Interactive tutorial on elements of the Swift 3 programming language. The focus of this tutorial will be on arrays, and we're just in the playground file right now. So I just went to Xcode, created a new playground project, and I just gave it a name and a location. Okay, so again, if you're not too familiar with the playground, it's just an environment that allows us to basically write and test our code without actually incorporating it into an app. And the great thing about Playground is that it runs constantly. I'm not sure how often it runs, but every once in a while it'll run and compile the code so that you can find out right away if there are issues, and also you get the variable values and stuff being displayed on the right here. I'm just going to open that up a little bit. So let's talk about arrays. Now, what is an array? An array is basically, and I'll write a definition, arrays are lists of items, really. So arrays can contain variables. They typically contain a bunch of variables. Arrays can actually contain other arrays, so we can have multi-dimensional arrays. And they can contain a whole host of different items. They can contain enumerations, and we'll see stuff like that later on. So that's getting into some complicated stuff. For now, just think of them as lists of items. So let's say we want to represent we want to group together a bunch of variables. So maybe we have a bunch of numbers that we want to throw together in a list. Well, an array is maybe one of the best ways to do it. So I'm going to say arrays are good for keeping groups or lists of items, and in brackets variables, together and representing them as one unit. Okay, so let's say we had like 5 integers or something. Well, instead of representing them as 5 separate integers and calling, the names of each one, we can just keep them in one list, in one item. And that's just going to be a list of type integer, and that can contain all 5 values. Okay, so arrays look a little like this. We have to call variable, and then we have the array name, and then if we like, we can give it a type. So let's just say type. However, to make sure it's an array, we have to put the type in the square brackets here, and that just makes sure that the compiler knows that it's not just a single variable, it's actually a list, it's an array. So for example, if we replace type with int, we could do that, and it just contains a list of integers. If we had string, then it just contains a list of strings. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this as type for now, and I know it's going to give me errors, so don't worry about that. Okay, so if we want to initialize it, right now it just in fact, let's use an example of an int. So right now it's just kind of an empty list with no values. It doesn't actually contain anything. We can give this a value of maybe an empty list, and as you can see, it just initializes it to be a completely empty list, so no values. We can give it some values if we want. That was a little messy. So 1, 2, and 3, and it populates the arrays with values 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so this is a basic array setup. Like I said, we can initialize its contain values, or we can initialize it to be empty. And the nice thing about Swift is that Swift is very array friendly, so there's lots of different functions that allow us to add to and take away from arrays. So we can add elements, we can delete elements, and it will resize the arrays accordingly. Because in other languages, arrays are very often of a fixed size. So in order to add to or delete elements from them, you have to create a new array, and it's a whole hassle. So yeah, Swift 3 is a really great language to become familiar with arrays in, because it has all these array-friendly functions. Okay, so it's a basic intro into arrays. We're going to take a look at a bunch of different variable types of arrays, such as integers. We'll look at floats and doubles. We can look at strings, booleans, characters, and stuff like that. And we'll see that arrays are really useful things. Okay, so we'll get started with different types, then we'll look at a bunch of different functions that we can call on arrays, ways we can add to them, take away from them, modify them, access them, do lots of stuff with arrays. Okay, so it's going to be a really useful tutorial. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learn a lot. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at Boolean arrays. So these are going to be the first type of arrays we'll look at. We'll look at each variable in turn, but we'll start with Booleans. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of arrays, and we're going to initialize one to be empty, and then we're going to give one some values, just so you can see kind of what a Boolean array might look like. So we're also going to show you some examples of where we would see these arrays either in real life or in the code. Okay, so now we've received a brief introduction into what an array is and what it looks like and how to set it up. Let's take a look at some specific types. So we've gone through all of the variable types in our variables tutorials. Well, rather the most common ones. So those were, I'll just write them down quickly. Those were booleans, ints, we had floats and doubles, and then we had characters and strings. Okay, so we're going to be looking at each one of these. So first we'll take a look at booleans in this part, then we'll take a look at ints, and then floats and doubles, and actually I'm going to combine these into one video, and then characters and strings. Okay, so basically in these next few videos I'm just going to show you some examples of these different types of arrays and where we might see them in code or in real life. Okay, so right now we'll be focusing on booleans. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize an array of booleans. So the way we do that, if you recall, is we call variable and then we give an array a name. So in this case it's going to be just boolean array, and we can make sure this is of type boolean. Remember the capital B, and we can choose to give this values or not. What we can do is if we want to leave the array blank right now, we can just do this, and it just is a blank array, so we know it's of type boolean, but it has no values in it yet. And that's why we see these two braces come up here, because we haven't given it any values yet. Okay, but if we want to populate it, we have to do something different. So we can either populate it on the same line, or we can do this. We can say bool array equals, and then give it some values like true, false, false, and it will initialize it to contain these values. If we drag this out, we see true, false, false printed out there, and that's because these are the values we've passed it. So again, we could either do it this way, or we could say bool array 2, and we could just declare a type, or we could leave it blank, much like a variable, and we could just give it some values here, so true, true, false, and it does pretty much the same thing. I know we gave it slightly different values, but this is just an example of doing it on one line versus two. So much like variables, we could initialize a boolean variable, so bool variable, and we could, if you want, you could give it a type, and you could just not initialize it, and then initialize it down here, and then true, or you could do it all on one line. It's pretty much exactly the same thing with these arrays. Okay, so from now onwards, for the purpose of these tutorials, I'm generally going to do it on one line, but just know that you can do it this way if you like. So this just first creates the blank array and then populates it with values down here, whereas this one just gives the type of array right away and populates it right away. Okay, so just know that you can include a type or not. So if we do this, that's fine too. So let's go into some examples. So where would we see Boolean arrays? Well, think about where you'd see a list of true and false values. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is going to be a true or false test. And we use this example when going through if statements and going through Booleans in general. So true-false tests might have some kind of an answer key, where we have something like answer key, and this will be of type Boolean, and what we can do is we can just say, so it's of type bool, and we'll just give it some values such as, let's say this is true, if I can type today, true, false, and maybe this is just like we called it an answer key, so we've got to assume it's an answer key. So this might be a good way to store the results of a true-false test. So we could have an answer key, then we could have some kind of like our test, so my test, and we could do the same thing, so it would be a Boolean array, and then let's say we get first question right, second question right, third question wrong, fourth question wrong, and the fifth question right. Okay, so these are some examples of where you might see Boolean arrays. So although teachers might kind of mark these things by hand, if there's a computer that does it for you, then this might be a good way to kind of store the results and check to see whether they're true. Alright, so just to recap, Boolean array is simply just an array of Booleans, a list of Boolean values. So we can pass it these true or false values, or we could even pass it statements such as 6 equals 6, and that will come out to be true. If we want, yeah, there we go, there's the update. So it's exactly the same with Booleans. We can pass it true false values, we can pass it these true false statements, or we can pass it variables that we've created. So we can pass it Boolean variables, so something like this, bool1, and we'll give it type Boolean, and we'll give it the value true, and we can pass that in if we want to. Okay, and it still comes out to be true. Alright, so that's Boolean arrays for you. A good example of where you might see them would be kind of like true-false tests, where you have a list of answers, a list of questions, and you might have to compare the two. Okay, so that's Boolean arrays. The next type we'll be looking at will be the number type, so we'll look at ints, floats, and doubles all in one. Okay, so this part focused on what Boolean arrays look like. So what we did is we created some arrays and gave them values, and we used the example for true-false test. So we had an array of answers that would be kind of like an answer key for a true-false test, which contained 5 different Boolean values, and we also made a kind of an our test version of the test, which contained our answers, also a bunch of true-false values in an array. And we also showed that you can pass in either true or false directly, you could give a true or false statement and pass that in, or you can create a true or false variable and pass that into the array. All of them are fine, and yeah, so those are Boolean arrays. We'll be looking at integer arrays, float arrays, and double arrays in this next part.